Alright, in this video we're going to talk about the three-domain system, and the three domains in classifying organisms are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So this is just a basic phylogenetic tree of the three domains. You have domain bacteria, domain archaea, and domain eukarya, or here eukaryota. Now remember that a domain is the broadest or the largest classification scheme on that hierarchy. So you have domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And so what this diagram here is showing is how these domains are broken up, or what organisms fall under each domain. What's interesting to note is that originally archaea and bacteria were grouped together in one domain, and the name of that domain was Monera. But as time went on, we developed more sophisticated techniques to sequence genomes and look at different RNA and things like that, and cell walls of organisms. And so over time, we actually decided that all of these organisms needed to be split up. And so then that's when Monera was split up into domain bacteria and archaea. Bacteria is going to be some of the more common pathogens that you're familiar with. For example, E. coli falls under the domain bacteria. And archaea, the word this word literally translates to ancient. And so these are going to be some ancient prokaryotes. And then of course eukaryota is going to contain things like plants, fungi, protists, and animals. Something else that's interesting to point out on this phylogenetic tree is that look at eukaryotes, look at bacteria, and remember, if this is showing evolutionary time, which is what a phylogenetic tree does, you can actually see that eukaryotes, including animals, we're right here, are actually more closely related to archaea, these ancient bacteria, than we are to these eubacteria, which is what we'll talk about in the kingdoms video. So I'm going to go over some basic characteristics of each domain. Unfortunately, there's no easy way to kind of remember this. These are just facts you have to be able to know in order to describe members of these three domains. So we're going to go through each of these domains and give you those characteristics. Domain bacteria. These organisms are going to be unicellular and prokaryotic. Remember, prokaryotic meaning no internal membranes or no membrane-bound organelles. So they have no nucleus, they have no mitochondria, they have no chloroplast. They just have those basic characteristics that all cells have. Members of this domain can be anaerobic or aerobic. Decomposers, which we're going to talk about in our ecology unit, most of the decomposers are going to fall under this domain, and they're going to recycle dead organic matter, very important in cycling nutrients. Most of the pathogens or common pathogens that you're familiar with fall under this domain, and the definition of a pathogen is just an organism that can cause a disease. Members can produce asexually or sexually, so an example of asexual is binary fission, which is just when one parent makes an exact copy of itself. Or it can undergo something like conjugation, which is sexual reproduction. This is what conjugation essentially looks like. You don't need to know much about it other than it's a very ancient form of sexual reproduction. You have an F- and an F+, which symbolizes kind of like male and female, and they form what's called a conjugation tube, where they actually start exchanging F factors, or those plasmids, and they get some recombination. So it's a form of sexual reproduction. Their cell wall, remember all prokaryotes have a cell wall, is made up of peptidoglycan, which is a complex carbohydrate, or very similar to a complex carbohydrate. These organisms can be autotrophic or heterotrophic. They don't have introns, which means those non-coding regions that have to stay inside the nucleus or that are not transcribed because they don't have a nucleus, but all of their DNA codes for something. And when you further break down this domain into a kingdom, it composes of the kingdom eubacteria. We'll talk about in the next video. Here's just a quick diagram showing you the cell wall of things called gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria you may have heard that fall in this domain. They both have a peptidoglycan layer on their cell wall, or that make up their cell wall. The difference between gram-positive and gram-negative, you can see that gram-positive is a much thicker layer of peptidoglycan than the gram-negative. And then you can also see this acid, this lipoteichoic acid, lipoteichoic acid, which sits right on top of that peptidoglycan. And so that's what differentiates gram-positive from gram-negative. Our second domain, domain archaea, these are going to be the ancient bacteria. These organisms are also going to be unicellular and prokaryotic, so no internal membranes, no membrane-bound organelles, very simple organisms. But what makes these guys actually different from bacteria is that we have extremophiles here, so organisms that can live in very extreme environments. We have methanogens, which can actually produce their own energy, and they do so by producing methane from hydrogen. Very interesting group of extremophiles. Halophiles, these are going to be those ancient bacteria that thrive in high salt concentrations. And then you have thermophiles, which thrive in high temperatures. And you're probably most familiar with this group when we talk about deep sea thermal vents and bacteria that sit there. Very interesting because they can actually do something called chemosynthesis, where they take chemicals and they actually produce their energy, very similar to like photosynthesis. And so those are going to be thermophiles. These guys actually do have some introns, which is what makes them what we think, more closely related to eukaryotes, because we've talked about eukaryotes having those introns. They do not have a peptidoglycan on their cell wall. Instead, they form something called this S layer, and this S layer is a little bit more complex and a little bit more sturdy, and that's what allows these extremophiles to be successful in these environments because of this S layer. They also have something called the pseudomurin, which is very similar to peptidoglycan, but it's a little bit more stable. And the kingdom that falls under this domain is kingdom Archaeobacteria. We'll talk about in the next video. And just to end here, the last domain that you're probably most familiar with, domain Eukarya. These are going to be eukaryotic cells, meaning that they have internal membranes. They have membrane-bound organelles. They have a nucleus. We've described all of these characteristics. These organisms can be unicellular or multicellular, going from protists all the way up to animals. They don't have peptidoglycan in their cell wall. So remember, plant cells are the only eukaryotes that have a cell wall, and their cell wall is not made up of peptidoglycan. And then this domain also makes up 4 kingdoms, and those kingdoms are Protista, Fungi, Plantae, and Animalia. And we're going to talk about the characteristics of all of those kingdoms in the next video.